When you hear the phrase Middle Ages, what pops into your head? Probably a dark, backward, violent time, right? An age of superstition, oppression, and stagnation, kind of stuck between the bright light of Rome and the glitter of the Renaissance. But what if I told you that entire picture, as common as it is, might be one of the biggest myths in history?
I mean, think about how often you hear that phrase. It's used as an insult when a politician wants to condemn an opponent's barbaric actions, or a journalist describes some horrific scene. They say, it's like we're back in the Middle Ages. The very word medieval has become a synonym for anything brutal, ignorant, or just plain old-fashioned.
But what if it's all a fabrication? The historian Jacques Heers argues that this whole negative image is an invention, a deliberate intellectual fraud, built by later ages for their own purposes. What if the 1,000-year period we so easily dismiss was something completely different?
According to Heers, this dark image is a carefully constructed black legend. It wasn't an accident, it was basically a campaign. So let's pull back the curtain and ask, who created this myth? And more importantly, why?
Yep, these are the classic cliches, right? The building blocks of the black legend we've all been taught. Darkness, barbarism, superstition, feudal oppression, and general backwardness. But let's start taking them apart, one by one. So who were the first architects of this myth? Well, surprisingly, it was a small but very influential group of Italian writers who wanted to make their own time look exceptional.
You have to think about the motive here. This wasn't some grand historical discovery. It was a PR campaign. By painting the previous 1,000 years as a dark, ignorant interlude, writers like Petrarch could elevate their own status and the status of their patrons. They were inventing their own greatness by inventing the darkness that came before.
And here's the central paradox. Just look at these dates. So many of the huge figures we associate with the dawn of the Renaissance, Dante, Giotto, even Boccaccio himself, were creating their masterpieces deep in the era that would later be called dark. The idea of a sudden rebirth just doesn't hold up. The lights were on the whole time.
The myth says the Renaissance rediscovered the classical world. But the reality? Medieval writers and artists were absolutely obsessed with it. They wrote endless epic poems about Alexander the Great and the Trojan War. They studied Virgil like he was a prophet. The inspiration wasn't rediscovered. It never, ever went away.
And here's the ultimate irony. While the humanists were writing these glowing tributes to ancient Rome, the popes and princes of the so-called Renaissance were literally knocking down ancient Roman temples and theaters for building materials. They were treating Rome's heritage like a quarry, not some sacred relic.
Okay, so the myth starts as artistic self-promotion, but it didn't stop there. It was later weaponized for political gain, turning the feudal lord into the perfect villain.
The terrible feudal lord we imagine was a political caricature built up over centuries. First, the king's men used it to argue for their own power over local lords. Then, the Enlightenment thinkers used it to attack the monarchy. And finally, the revolutionaries used it to tear down the entire old order.
The myth paints this picture of a lazy, brutal lord living off the sweat of his serfs. But Heers argues the reality was often that of a land manager, an administrator, sometimes not even the richest person in the village. And the idea that every peasant was a powerless serf completely ignores the existence of something pretty amazing, an allod. This was land owned free and clear by a peasant family, not subject to the rents and obligations we associate with feudalism. Rural society was so much more diverse and complex than the simple oppressor-oppressed narrative allows. You had peasant landowners and powerful village communities.
So we've seen how this myth was built for artistic and political reasons. But why has it been so durable? Why do we still cling to it? The answer is deeper, and it has to do with our own collective psychology. And this gets to the core psychological reason the myth endures. By creating a scapegoat era, a time defined by darkness and barbarism, we make ourselves feel superior. It lets us see our own time as the triumphant result of progress. It's a comforting story, isn't it?
So when you ask who benefited, the answer is, well, pretty much everyone who came to power afterwards. From popes to kings to revolutionaries, every group found a reason to paint the past as dark to justify their own vision for the future. We've seen how the sausage gets made. We've seen the motives and the methods behind the creation of the Dark Ages. But this isn't just an academic exercise. It has a powerful takeaway about how we see the world today.
Because ultimately, this whole analysis isn't just about defending the Middle Ages. It's about revealing a fundamental truth about how history itself actually works. Just think about that for a second.
History is not a pure objective collection of facts. It's a narrative, a story that is constructed with a purpose. It's shaped by the biases, the politics, and the self-interest of the people telling it. The myth of the Middle Ages is just one giant example of a story told to serve the present, not to accurately reflect the past.
And that leaves us with a final question for you. If this foundational story of Western civilization, the dark night followed by a glorious rebirth, is an invention, then what other historical truths that we take for granted might also be carefully constructed narratives? What other stories deserve a second look?